Today on the Relationship Revival Show, we have a special guest named Janice Taylor. Janice is one of Oprah Winfrey's top 150 tech pioneers. She's a social tech entrepreneur, inspirational speaker, author, online safety advocate, healing mentor, investor, mother, and advisor. From her teen years into adulthood, Janice's specialty has constantly been uncovering the root cause of emotional pain to create an innovative and disruptive healing process. After more than 2 decades of research and practice, uniquely qualified in the fields of psychology, tech startup, business, motivational speaking, and entrepreneurism, Janice Taylor created AHA Healing, a unique revolutionary healing modality with a multidisciplinary approach whose sole purpose is to solve early pain points in humans and transform them into purpose. You're listening to the Relationship Revival Podcast with John DeBach, also known as Mr. Spirituality. That's me. I'm your host, giving you insights and guidance from over 10 years in the field of this amazing journey we call romance. On this show, I go over everything you need to know about how to get into a relationship, how to get the most out of a relationship, and sometimes even how to gracefully end a relationship without pulling your hair out and going crazy. And occasionally, I'm even joined by new and old friends who are also relationship experts to bring you guidance and wisdom with new perspectives. Thanks for stopping by. Janice Taylor, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime I can explore a new modality to help people heal and kind of understand the theory. Selfishly, that's just, maybe it's another tool in my own belt. Maybe it's something I can refer to people. So I think people in my position really got into doing what they do because we want to help. So if there's a way where there's something out there that'll help even just one person I meet somewhere down the line, I feel like it's totally worth it.
I agree.
So tell me, so you created this modality called Ahava, right?
Yes, this has been a lifelong, journey to creating it.
And what is it? And what is the theory and who does it help?
Yeah, great question. So Ahava really for me is the name of the theory. And I grew up on the streets like many people did. My dad was an addict. I spent half my life at his house where it was literally everyone. And then I go to my mom's house and she was trying to figure out how to feed us. So I was really in that environment, in the thick of it. And I was always sort of fascinated by how do we heal from these experiences that we have as kids? I've always wanted to understand that piece of the puzzle. And so really studying, what happens before our 10th birthday that creates, I call it the break in the spirit, or you could say the psychic wound according to Gabor Mate. And there's other different variations of the exact same thing. But I didn't want to call it trauma per se, because I feel that people say, I don't have trauma. Right. When really you can still have that break in the spirit where we feel this break of a love and belonging, a sense of where do I belong and do I matter? And I really wanted to get to the root of that, to say what's happening in that lifelong feeling that many of us experience. In fact, I would say 99% of the world has a bit of that break where we kind of go, what's the point of my life? And I wanted to understand that. So I started it really, I say 40 years ago, because the very first program I went into as an at-risk youth was how do we prevent this kid from being an addict was really the focus, because my dad was an addict. I basically started to write the theory at that first program when I was 8 years old, but really dove into it when I was doing my psychology degree.
Okay.
And the fundamental question was, how do we heal from our early pain points before our 10th birthday often? And what is the point of these painful experiences that we have? And can we make more sense of them? But more importantly, could we heal that core root of pain?
Okay. Well, so it sounds like you've identified the problem. How does Ahava as a theory or AHA as your company and the brand, what is the actual practice of the work that goes into it look like?
Great question. So the theory pulled from 12 different theories and a multiple different therapeutic processes. So I looked across religious studies, psychology, neuroscience. What is this whole new age self-help? I think, therefore I am. I really looked at the gamut of theories, and I pulled from each one of them that I felt could address the core root of the problem. And there's other different types of approaches, whether it's client-centered therapy and different therapies. So I looked across the gamut of what existed, and I felt that a lot of them kind of got you halfway there. So we take that theory, and then I created 12 steps and actually 3 phases that really, first of all, discover, well, what is the pain point? And I felt that there needed to be more definitions of that pain point versus, oh, this is your symptoms and here's your diagnosis in mental health. I felt that there was more to that data. So we extract that data and we put it onto a whiteboard, but we look at all of the connective tissue. I created a math formula to then address, well, you're stuck here. A portion of your emotional being is stuck before your 10th birthday. Can we pluck out that thorn, heal down the root, and continue this process for 6 months over those 12 exact steps? And every single step is slightly different that takes you on a continuum of health, of emotional healing. One of the things I think that's most interesting for me that I discovered, emotional pain actually is a system. When you experience that break, it's not like, oh, my dad's bad, my mom's bad. That's actually not what transpires, although that story starts. It's actually a system of emotional pain. And if you don't address healing from a system perspective, highly you will still repeat the same pattern. You'll hit the wall, you'll come back. You'll hit the wall, you'll come back. And most people that have gone through therapy have felt that they get so far with it, but they ultimately hit the wall. And because of that, I needed to create a very concise program, very concise steps. And each one of those steps, we draw from a different theory. And we take people through a continuum of healing that really we at Ahava, we say, you really can heal this emotional root and you can discover what you were always meant to be and do. And you can let go of this past trauma. And you can experience the fullness of yourself. And so each step I spent 10 years studying in real life humans, how to get those steps down to a precise science.
And so there's 12 steps over 6 months.
Yeah.
If you're working with a certified Ahava practitioner, what do those look like? What does that relationship look like?
So they see you, sometimes you could do an accelerated program where you want more intensive. So you'll see them every week. It's really interesting. The first phase of Ahava, so the 4 steps that are in the first phase, it's you with a one-on-one healer. In phase 2, we pull from different modalities. And so we make up the team. I believe in a triage approach. So you may have a naturopath, a massage therapist, Reiki, and you may have your Ahava healer taking you through that process. In phase 2, when the body is ready and the spirit is ready to dive in deeper into some of your emotional pain. And then when you come through it into the last 4 phases, the 4 steps, then they're actually taking you through another approach. So some of this, you have intensive homework. I believe in an emotional fitness routine, which I believe most people don't have. They have a physical fitness, but if you say, oh, so what's your daily emotional fitness routine? And they'll be like, well, I see my therapist every 2 weeks, or, I meditate with Calm once in a while, but they don't really have a concise daily emotional fitness routine for themselves that's built custom for themselves as well.
That's phase 2.
That's really the whole part of it. It builds, each step builds on the next step. And then in phase 2, you have a triage approach. And then when you come into homecoming, it's different teammates. So, but the healer, the AHA healer is your steady Eddie through the 12 full steps. And each one is concisely designed.
Got it. And so depending on what the wound, I guess you can call it is, because you don't want to use the word trauma, depending on what it is and who you are kind of defines what that healing process looks like, and it's customized to you.
Yeah, there's a certain cadence. So no one skips the steps after all these years and hundreds of people later. No one skips from 2 to 7. Never. Sure. So that's predictable. And because I come from the tech industry, that's very predictable. People will always move from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3. The initial whiteboard, which we call the calling center, that's a huge 2 to 3 hour session. So some of your core root data actually is really important. Like, is your family Italian? Were you first generation immigration? Like, all of those parts of your data actually inform the therapeutic practice. as opposed to now people are like, oh, I should just go see a cognitive behavioral therapist. Well, that may or may not work for you depending on where you are on your healing journey. And so again, being from the tech industry, I was like, okay, what's the system? And can we create this steady step so that it anchors the world of healing? And I think that's a really important distinction. If you look at the world of healing, you probably have seen now like, oh, you should have ayahuasca, or you should microdose shrooms, or you should go to Burning Man, or you should meditate, or you should see a therapist. Like there's lots of tactics, but the ultimate question for me was, okay, so when, where, when, how, and at what point? And so really I looked at it and said, well, this is the world of healing tactics. Can we anchor this into a system that still addresses the same thing for every human being, but what sits on each step will be modified depending on your own story?
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So I can wrap my head around it. You have these 12 steps. You said the first 4 were phase 1, which sounds diagnostic in nature more than anything.
Less around the problem and more around the purpose.
Okay.
So we look at everything from the opposite point of view. So most people know their pain story. This happened to me. This is who I am. And it actually kicked that system. We would call it the ecosystem of you looking to solve that outside of yourself. So it would kick in the storytelling. Oh, my brother's this, my sister's that. This is my life. Like that's that remote, that sort of like constant memory. And so you pretty much have that on lock, most humans. But what you don't necessarily have is what does that initial pain point, what's its opposite piece of data? And so if you think about emotional trauma, think of it like a battery. You know, when you look at a battery, it's got both ends of the battery and one can't charge without the other being in the right spot. Well, most people know the negative side of their battery. They know what that means. But what they don't know is what does that data point actually reveal on the other side of the moon? What is it on the positive side? What is it actually revealing about that? So the very first session is called the calling session. And I believe, and have been able to prove to a certain degree, that most of the data that you own before your 10th birthday is the purest data that you own, even if it was horrible, even if it broke your heart, even if it caused you to be disconnected from yourself. It's still the only data that you don't pick. You don't pick your mother or your father. You don't pick your date of birth. You don't pick your hair color, eye color, skin color. You don't pick any of those things. So, but if you looked at it only from the one side of the perspective, on the negative side of the battery, if you were to take that same data and plot it on the other side of the moon, what would it say? And would it give you different GPS coordinates? And would it tell you a different story about yourself? And so creating the math around that took me about a decade to say, could I actually intersect specific points of data that could tell this person their calling, that it would ultimately tell them who they are and what they were always meant to be.
It sounds interesting. I'm having a hard time getting like a grounded example, especially when you say things like math. I'm like, wait, what? So like, do you have, because you've worked with hundreds of people, can you, keeping it anonymous, give me an example of a negative story or a negative thing and what the positive charge is so I can ground it a little bit for myself?
Yeah. Okay, so just take any human being before your 10th birthday. Let's say that you are the middle child.
Okay.
Okay, so you're the middle child of 3. What do we know in society? What do they say about the middle child? Pretty much everyone, right? Black sheep, doesn't fit in. My older sibling's the golden child. My younger is the spoiled one. I'm like the one that everyone craps on. I'm the middle child.
Sure.
So that's the story. So you know that potentially your middle child syndrome, you had a second sibling, or your youngest sibling was born 2 years from your birthday.
Okay.
So you know that all of a sudden you went from being the youngest to boom, there's this new person.
Uh-huh.
And everyone wants to pay attention to this new person because it's a baby. And so you being 2 are already observing, oh, wow, my world's changed. So that gives us a first indication of a potential date. Now, let's say that you're the oldest child and you were now born to your parents, and your parents also have a birth order of where they felt that they identified. I'm the oldest child, I'm the middle child, I'm the oldest of 7, I had to care for all my siblings. Actually creates a psychological component in your codependency. how you see yourself. So the oldest child is always born into a fixed codependent triangle. Mothers are often martyrs, fathers perpetrators. That leaves the oldest child to be the victim in some cases. It's a triangulation of your human experiences. So I'll give you an example. And I know she won't mind me telling this story. So one of our healers actually was kidnapped when she was 8 years old by her mother. And they went and they lived overseas, and it took several years before her father ever to find her. Now, that has been the story of her data. She was one of the very first kids in the years that she actually disappeared that were milk carton kids that were put on the milk carton. Now, if you tell that story over and over again, that would be, this is her pain story. And perhaps she spent much of her life looking to find the answers as to, why did her mother do that? Why did that happen to me? Why me? Why was I the one that was taken on that? So that's the story that people tell. Now, what she's doing with it is creating an entire documentary series on children that actually were milk carton kids. And it turns out that in America, for example, there are millions of children that get abducted every year by the other parent. Now, everyone's like, oh, once they reunite, they think that story's over. But because of her personal experiences and her pain point, she knows that that's just actually the beginning of this story. Because now you have to rectify returning home to the parent. You have to rectify, how do I make sense of this? So we were able to take all of her pain data, and now she can use that data of her personal experiences of what she actually survived, not only to create new legislations and laws, which is part of her purpose plan, she's creating a documentary series, but also a therapeutic process that completely addresses what happens to these kids when they come back. Now, we were able to establish all of that in the very first session that she had with AHAVA. We knew that this data had to have a different meaning. It had to have a different point of view. And we take the philosophy that pain must equal purpose. There is no other point for the pain if it doesn't carry the ingredient to do something for a higher good. But many people stay lost in the pain story. This is my story. This is my story. Oh, I'm never going to be like them. I'm going to work hard. My dad didn't work hard, so I'm working hard. You carve out stories out of emotional pain that may or may not be true based on a perspective that is quite limited because you're a child. And so you then spend much of your life operating from your ego, from your logic, and not very much time operating from your soul, from what is actually the point of this. Does it actually have a meaning? Now, we go to step 2, which is the refusal. So once someone sees the calling, people go, no, I can't, I'm not writing a documentary. Hell no, I can't do any of that. That's not who I am. I'm this. I need to pay bills. I need to run a job. Forget that. That's not who I am. So then they go to refusal and they refuse the gift. And so then there's a process to unravel. Why am I refusing it? What is in the belief structure of this? Is the story that I have told myself about my family structures actually the truth? And so it's only truth from a perspective, but that perspective has infinite potential other ideas around it. And this is where I looked at neuroscience. And when I say the math, there is math. Every human being actually has a very cyclical mathematical pattern of how they live. It's why we've been able to have people addicted to social media as much as we have. Humans are pretty predictable. And there's a lot of math that actually goes into your own data. And so from that, we're able to extract what I call your golden triangle data. That's actually a math problem. So just by virtue of cross-referencing time periods, dates, of all of your DNA, of your data, all of that, we're actually able to see that your pain story actually has similar data in your golden triangle data. And humans are very patterned. They're very predictable. And as I said earlier, emotional pain actually is a system. It unleashes in the human experience a system that controls much of how you think, what you believe about yourself, what you attract to yourself. That's actually quite a scientific system. And it's a response to early trauma points before your 10th birthday. It's buried into your subconscious, into your unconscious part of your being. But emotions live in that iceberg below you. And so when you experience emotion, that's actually what gets kicked into gear is the system. And it's an emotional system. And that's most people operate out of an emotional pain system, not their purpose system.
It's interesting. I mean, you talk about math and you talk about, predictability. And yet what's fascinating is kind of the general underlying theory sounds like pain has purpose, which is a spiritual concept, right? You're not going to find that in the scientific literature. So it's
Yep.
like you're kind of having this weird bridge between a very
Mhm.
technical scientific approach and
Of
a
course.
very spiritual approach.
Yes, thank you for recognizing that, because that's actually quite intentional. And this is why I looked across 12 different theories and also different therapeutic practices and pulled from them to make my own, because they were missing, each one of the theories were just missing a certain part of the equation. So if you look at cognitive behavioral therapy, which I'm a fan, so for those cognitive behavioral therapists out there, I am a fan.
Mm-hmm.
But I also feel that it's limited. Then if you look at the emergence of humanistic psychology, for example, humanistic in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we talk about sort of the top of the pyramid, which is self-actualization and transcendence. If you think about that, well, what does that actually mean? Well, that must include the spirit. But Abraham Maslow and many of his, ironically, his peers started to then evolve into something called transpersonal psychology, which acknowledges the spirit. So unless a human being fundamentally believes they don't have a soul, then aha is probably not for you. It's
Sure.
just, if you think I got no soul, I'm here,
Right.
then for sure. But most humans, not from religion, if we separate spirituality from religion,
Yeah.
most of us think we have a soul. And is the soul just a dead entity that just sits in the body, or is it an active component in our life? Can it have an active purpose? And I believe that the component of the soul that's most powerful is in our emotional healing. That when we talk about a psychic break, it's in the subconscious, it's in the unconscious. And Carl Jung really sort of alluded to this again at the end of his life, where we said, there's got to be this unconscious, subconscious part of our being. Well, what is that? Some people will say, well, it's just, the Freudian side of it. I would argue that that's an active voice, purpose of your life, of your soul. It's your digital black box, so to speak, within yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You can only get so far with the head of the logic, the cognitive portions of when we are awake. I actually find that quite simple. Most of it is quite simpleton. That there needed to be this bridge and this merge between these two halves of self, so to speak. You have an ego self and you have a soul self. And we are often operating because of pain from the ego self, not necessarily from the soul self. So how do you merge the two together? And this is what I've been studying the last 25 years. And I felt that when anyone says, well, this is the absolute way, I always felt that there was part of the equation was missing. Well, where's this other piece of this puzzle? There's this only, and I've been put through the programs as a guinea pig because of my own human experiences. And I was always feeling like, okay, part of this theory works, but what about kids that are hungry? What about women? Most of the psychological theories were invented by men. And so if you look at all the fathers of psychology, most of them are missing women. And what about people of color? There's more to be learned from these pieces of it. So if you look at even the field of psychology, it only got so far. In the last, probably 30, 40 years, we're seeing an emergence of more women in these spaces. Even in philosophy, which I studied, I looked at philosophy. Much of the early philosophers were all men. Religious studies, if you look at the religious studies, most of the theories were invented by men. And so if you look at a cultural piece to that, well, what are men taught? What are men culturally wired to believe? They're traditionally culturally wired to believe that how they think, their intellect, their solving problems of the head is part of their identity. It's a part of what gives them validity. Where if you look at culturally, what are women taught? Use your mother's intuition. Where's your intuition? You should have mother's intuition. We're taught actually something different. We're taught to feel. And so if you look at the two pieces of that puzzle, how do we merge that together so it's more cohesive in its understanding of our human experience? Because there's much to be learned from those fathers of psychology. But there's also much to be learned from women and people of color and culturally what they've encountered in their human experience. And that's where the spirit and the soul and the feeling portion of our being can be. And so I really looked at the gamut and thought, okay, where do they all agree? So that's where I started. Okay, does this theory agree to this theory? And does this theory agree with this one? And I thought, well, if I could find 3 points of intersection where they all agreed, then we must be onto something in terms of truth. If I felt that only one part of the theory and nobody else agreed with that, I didn't really look at it and thought, okay, but what is it really saying? And so this entire journey of that took 25 years.
Fascinating trajectory.
Thanks.
When you're dealing with the wounds or the trauma, it's putting the purpose on it is such a drastically different approach than a lot of the modern psychological modalities. I mean, even if you look at something as kind of popular right now as EMDR, right in the name of the title, it's desensitization. So there's this idea that if you have trauma, to expose yourself to it, because it comes from exposure theory. So it's like you expose yourself to it so it's no longer traumatic, but then you're right, it stops there. So it's like, so you can move on with your life knowing that it just happened to you. And this, do you do desensitization of the
Yes.
trauma? Okay. Is that part of your process?
That's in phase two. And I call it feeling work, desensitization, exposure therapy, how you want to look at it. It's such an important evolution in the field of psychology. So I give mad love to that. But then I was like, okay, once that's happened, so then what? I suppose I had
Right.
this antlers. Could that still be enough for the person to know, why did this happen to me?
Mm-hmm.
Does that solve that nagging sensation of, why did this happen to me? And so if we look at Maslow's hierarchy, if you look at where much of the thorns exist, the thorns, I say, like what's put into the spirit of
Sure.
the thorn before the 10th birthday. You sort of look at the hierarchy and you look at food and basic needs. Many people have their thorns there because they grew up poor like I did. We struggled with food. I remember eating a lot of moldy things in my life, stealing ketchup packets out of fast food restaurants because that's what the sauce was. So I didn't have to taste how bad the food was. Many people that grew up in the condiment side of the world would relate to that story. Then just above that is love and belonging. So if we look at sort of the empathic roots and the history of that, we know that children need to witness empathy in order to experience a sense of love and belonging. And so they need to witness it. And so we know that babies come into the world actually relational creatures. They come in relational, not just with basic needs. They come in already with a sense of relationship. And much of the early child psychology actually points to this notion of relationship and empathy. When mothers are breastfeeding and the babies see the faces, like how that all starts to form this sense of self. But if you look at where much of the thorns of human experience go and where they get stuck and why many people don't progress to self-actualization and onto transcendence, is because they've never been able to rectify this sense of love and belonging, which I believe underneath that is the question of, do you matter? And if you've experienced trauma or a pain point in any regard, and even though you have the exposure therapy and you can go through the trauma, are you still left with the sensation of, do I matter? And I really think that when you look at the field of technology, where I've lived in Silicon Valley, as you know, and been in the startup ecosystem, is that much of what social media is doing for people in a delusional way, because it's temporary, is giving people a sense of love and belonging. Oh, I'm part of this group. Oh, I'm in this group. I can talk about my traumas and everybody agrees that I should feel this way or be angry about this. We are seeking that constant need of that validation. And so even if you are gone through that part of the therapeutic practice and the triggering components of your trauma can be lowered and can be released from the body, that's still left at the bottom. I call it the sediment at the bottom of that pain bucket, is still the sensation of you wondering whether you matter.
Really different approach, really interesting kind of perspective of the world and the way human behavior works. If someone's interested in doing aha healing, what is the best way? I'm going to post all your links and everything in the show notes so people can obviously, tag and follow and look into you more. But what's the easiest and best way for them to connect with this?
So they can go right to our website, to ahahealing.com. That's probably the easiest. If you want to ask me direct questions, hit me up on Twitter. DM me. I'm there. Just be Janice. I answer all sorts of questions about that there. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me if you want to speak to me directly. If you want to go to Instagram, our team is there as well. One thing just to leave some of your viewers with, if they're curious to do this at home, if they want to know a little bit of what their golden triangle data is, this is the ultimate question of, do you matter? So there's 3 points of intersection that every human has. The first is you. So you have your, what we would call your big P. So we call it the big P because pain equals purpose. So it's your big P. It's when there's a life change moment, sibling born, parents divorced, first memory you have sometimes of a traumatic event perhaps, or even something simple of getting dropped off at kindergarten and screaming your head off when your mother left you there because you did not want to go, but you remember the moment distinctly. That is your first date. So my case, my date is 1983. So that's my first date. So you have 2 other intersecting points of data. Those 2 other intersecting points of dates are people that you attach most of your pain to. So it's who you think gave you the most pain. Could be your sibling, could be your mother and your father. And so if you look at those 2 dates, let's just use your mother and father, they too have a big P before their 10th birthday. So all of your big P moments are before your 10th birthday for everyone. And I will say that. Some people say it's after, but we use 10 as a coaching mechanism for that.
Why so 10? Why did you kind of decide?
Interesting. Actually, some of it is biblical. So if you look at sort of the emergence between where we have from Noah right down to Adam, it was actually decades. You see that our world kind of functions in decades where we see changes over of the years. If you look at the Torah, for example, they use the number 10. And when I looked at child psychology, it felt that, yes, some would say before 2, you're fully formed. I looked at this from a collection of data perspective, that much of your data before your 10th birthday, you don't pick. And neither did your parents. So if you look now at your parents' data, so let's say that your parents also had divorces or children born, same criteria. So in my case, I look at my mother's and my father's dates, then I know I've got 1947 and I've got 1948. So let's say that my years now are 1983, 47, and 48. Go make a playlist. Live in those dates. Those are your collection of data dates. Everything that lies inside of that golden triangle will tell you a lot about who you really are. So
what do you mean by living in those dates? What does that mean?
Like for the next 2 weeks, so in I'll have a client, we have them eat food from those time periods. Let's say that they were Italian. We have them eat that food. We have them make a playlist for music just from those years. So you're going to 20 minutes a day play music. For me, 83, thank God, because music's really good. I'm like, great, I got an 80s. I've got the 40s. That's actually my playlist. I look at movies and news. So what was happening around that time period for my parents and what was happening around me culturally. So the layers of cultural trauma. And we live in those experiences. We research them. So as opposed to scrolling on Twitter for the latest nonsensical thing, you actually live in your golden triangle dates. You take in the content, the movies, the books. And what most of the Ahava clients find is that there is more downloads of data. But they go, oh my God, this happened. So using the example at the beginning in one of our healers' case, which she discovered when she discovered her pain point, was the year that they started to put kids on milk cartons that were missing children. She didn't know that. So hence why her documentary is called Milk Carton Kids. Her pain point, when she dove into the data, she discovered that in those years, everything shifted and changed. And her pain point was directly related to a cultural change. And so if you think about trauma is first within yourself. It's within your family. We talk about intergenerational. But then there's cultural. What's happening around these human beings during that time period that would have them change how they show up in the world, how they would respond. And so those are what I call the rings of trauma. So there's always layers within this. And then you can discover your golden triangle.
Janice Taylor, thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
If you're interested in learning how to get the absolute most out of your romantic relationships, then you're in luck, because I have put together a free workshop or masterclass, if you will, about 3 secrets that people in happy relationships have discovered. You can view the workshop at mrspirituality.com/3secrets. Again, it's completely free. Just go there and watch it. It'll help you on your journey, give you some wisdom, some things to think about. The website again is mrspirituality.com/3secrets. That's mrspirituality.com/3 The word secrets. It's all yours. Enjoy.